the big complexities here is the fact that not only have they been located on Gazan soil, but actually beneath the soil, because there's an entire city and network of tunnels. And I'd like to bring in our next guest. Joining me now is Dr. Daphné Richemond-Barak, the head of the International Law Desk at the Institute for Counterterrorism at Richemond University. She is also an expert on subterranean warfare. Welcome to the Breaking News edition here on the I-24 News Desk, and thanks for being with us this morning. It's seen an uptick in modern and urban warfare, but usually this kind of warfare includes two types: naturally made like caves or artificially made like subway systems. But how often are these manually engineered for the purpose that Hamas is using them in Gaza?
Thank you. There is no doubt that Hamas has perfected the art of subterranean warfare to levels that are unprecedented, both in contemporary warfare, even if you compare to the tunnels that were used by ISIS in Syria and Iraq, or if you compare to the Viet Cong tunnels in Vietnam. Hamas has perfected the art of tunnel warfare because it's been part of its strategy as a terrorist group for the last 2 decades, almost 20 years, that Hamas has innovated and discovered new ways in which to use the underground in offensive and defensive ways to weaken its opponent, the Israeli military. And now this places the IDF in a very significant operational challenge, as it has to release or rescue the hostages that are being held in the Gaza Strip, but also fight in an urban terrain where civilians are located in the vicinity of tunnels and around tunnels as well.
Daphné, are they accounted to direct airstrikes? You mentioned that there's a challenge at the moment for the IDF. How much of them can actually be penetrated or even destroyed with targeted airstrikes? And if it's not that effective, what other measures can be used to dismantle them?
The main problem that underground warfare raises is that it neutralizes the advantage, the military advantage that a sophisticated military like the IDF really possesses. It really neutralizes all of the capabilities in intelligence gathering and surveillance, and it makes it very difficult for the IDF to assess how many rockets does Hamas have, what does it plan to do, what kind of operations is it planning. All of this becomes very complicated when this is really the main strategic appeal of tunnels, right? That they allow its users to operate undetected, far away from the eyes of a much more sophisticated army that is fighting. So what we see now is that the IDF, again, is facing this operational challenge. The methods that the IDF must use at this time are methods that will ensure the full destruction, what we call a hard kill, the collapse of the walls and the roofs of all of these subterranean structures. Merely neutralizing the structures is no longer an option. This is what Israel did in 2014 and in 2021. No longer on the table. Right now, what is needed is a destruction of this military underground infrastructure, which includes in it or integrates below ground in immense networks of tunnels, everything that you'd expect a military to have, from ammunition factory to ammunition depots to command and control centers, and everything else that might be supporting the Hamas military enterprise against Israel.
Not to mention the flow of running water and constant electricity, although they claim not to have any fuel in the Gaza Strip. From the perspective of international law and rules of law, do they apply to this kind of warfare? Because no doubt Israel is going to be facing the calls of war crimes and not abiding by international law. We're already seeing it as the offensive enters what it's being called a limited operation and not a full-scale incursion into the Gaza Strip. So how do these rules apply here?
These rules, definitely what we call the laws of war, the laws of armed conflict, they apply to any belligerent in any conflict pretty much. So definitely they apply to Hamas, and Hamas has violated them first and foremost by the very act of digging this subterranean network under homes and mosques and hospitals, which are the most protected objects under international humanitarian law. And these tunnels, this subterranean network of kilometers of tunnels and different stories of tunnels and rooms, first and foremost, and endangers the Gaza population itself, the people who are living in Gaza. It exposes them to explosions and to accidents and to collapses and to the weakening of the entire civilian infrastructure there. And of course, to the anti-tunnel strikes that the military will take to destroy them. So first and foremost, Hamas has committed here a major war crime. And then in terms of whether these rules apply to Israel as well, absolutely. Even though Israel has been the victim of an absolutely horrendous attack, the rules continue to apply. These basic rules of targeting only military targets and not targeting intentionally civilians, which is something that you were discussing just before I came on. These are rules that apply across the board, and Israel will, for sure, try to minimize as much as possible, in accordance with the laws of war, the civilian casualties which are inevitable as a result of the strike against these targets if the population is not fully evacuated. But the laws of war, they do not, unfortunately, contemplate a zero casualty type of warfare. This is the reality of war, and civilians will, unfortunately, be killed on both sides. The question is, from the point of view of international humanitarian law, whether the collateral damage that will be caused to civilian infrastructure and civilian lives will be excessive in comparison to the military advantage that Israel can anticipate from the said strike. And if you do this balancing act, which is what IDF commanders do all the time, it is very difficult in urban warfare. It is very difficult, even more difficult in subterranean warfare, and it becomes almost impossible to overcome in a context of having hostages, over 200 of them, used as human shields inside those military tunnels.
Well, Doctor, let me ask you this. Perhaps there is no reasoning with those who so staunchly hold to the Hamas narrative in Gaza, but as an expert on this topic, how would you explain that this is not assisting the prospects of peace in the region and that this is a tactic of terror? And also on that point, why then, if these tunnels are so sophisticated and so deep underground, does Hamas not allow innocent Palestinian civilians to use the tunnels as shelter from Israeli airstrikes the same way that Israel has bomb shelters and bunkers on its territory?
It would be an absolute disaster if Palestinian civilians would get into these tunnels at the moment. These tunnels, they are a military infrastructure and they must remain so. This is actually a much preferred course of action for Palestinian civilians because they will be otherwise killed in the anti-tunnel strikes. So there is no doubt that Hamas should have built shelters for its civilians, but they should be civilian shelters and not these tunnels that are military in nature and constitute legitimate targets. I want to tell you that in Ukraine in 2022, there were Ukrainian soldiers that used an underground structure as part of a steel plant in Azovstal. And the fighters, the Ukrainian fighters and soldiers were inside the structure, and so came civilians. And this became a humanitarian disaster because the civilians ended up being in major danger from this military infrastructure that the Ukrainian soldiers were using. So the civilians must stay away from the tunnels, and this is why we would hope that the hostages would also be taken out of those tunnels so that this can be struck as a military target exclusively while minimizing the collateral damage to civilians.
Dr. Daphné Richemond-Barak, the head of the International Law Desk at the Institute for Counterterrorism at Richemond University and an expert on subterranean warfare. I want to thank you so very much for your analysis and your expertise here on the I-24 News Breaking News edition.
Thank you for having me.